university. I felt very privileged to be there because it was sort of the pinnacle of what I considered, Western democratic, using your brains for good, I'd say. And then I went to Sandhurst, and I felt very privileged to be there. I was a soldier in Northern Ireland, and even in Northern Ireland, it never occurred to me that I was on the wrong side or I might be the bad guy, even though there were various inquiries, a stalker inquiry, I think it was called, and I began to see a dark side, but at that stage I still believed, and I think I was probably right, that there were exceptions. And I slowly, it doesn't happen overnight because your team is your team, but Guantanamo Bay shook me up. And also I'd been to Afghanistan. I'd been to Afghanistan in 2000 when the Taliban were running it. So I had a deeper understanding of the country, and I knew what wasn't true and what was true. I knew, for example, that despite the propaganda, the Taliban had actually destroyed the opium poppy. They did control the country. They were the de facto government. And they were the victims of a lot of sort of corporate media propaganda, or even before we went there. They weren't angels by any means, but they were a product of their context, like any and the context was something that we, the Western world, had created. John Pilger found out that we had, the Americans were sponsoring hardline terrorists, Islamic terrorists, very sort of fundamental, barbaric people, even before the Russians invaded. We created chaos in Afghanistan, and then we kind of got upset when the chaos came back to bite us. It's the similar thing to what's happening in Syria, in that we create chaos, and it used to make me particularly angry in Syria when I'd find out that the Pentagon was sponsoring these, terrible people to fight the Assad regime, and people who there was no way they would let them take over the country. Without having learnt the lessons of Osama bin Laden, to think that if you sponsor hardline rebels and then, of course, you double-cross them and say, well, we weren't really trying to help you, we were just using you for our long-term aims of expansionism, they're going to come back to New York City. And the fact that they were doing the same thing again made me very angry. In Afghanistan, I began to see on the micro and macro level, and this is, not only were soldiers killing people, but they were getting medals for it. We wanted war in Afghanistan, and I could see it wasn't just a matter of a few bad apples. It was something deeper than that. It's good to speak to people like yourselves, because it won't come as a shock to you, but it came as a shock to me, and again, it won't come as a shock to you that I could not get anyone in the corporate media, and it's all corporate media in Australia, to be interested. They might be interested in a murder or a rape, but they weren't interested in the idea that the whole war was a kind of rigged casino. And it was actually it was really a win for America, in the same way that you talked about Iraq. It was a win because they turned a lot of public money into private money, in that although they didn't beat the Taliban, they probably never wanted to. They just wanted to spend billions on it, of taxpayer money, on it. And then the Halliburtons and all those companies that you mentioned, there was a really terrible company called DynCorp who ran all the bases, and the bases was a huge business. And of course, they would give George W. Bush or Barack Obama, they'd give them big donations back. The fact that they got $100 million base deal, or probably 500 million, and so they'd give 50 million or 10 million back to the probably the Democrats and the Republicans, and so it was a win-win for those people. I don't think they wanted to win the war, or well, they knew that they were already winning. They were winning by making money and getting a foothold. There were lots of pluses for it, but of course the losers were the Afghan people. And as a soldier, I was still a true believer in that. One of the big losers, of course, was the soldiers. And these are people that a lot of them are really good people. They come from poor backgrounds. They dedicate their lives to the country. They do tour after tour. And the idea that we were wasting them in order for some large geopolitical game, which was like a joke for people like Tony Blair. We had people in Australia. And I think I really flipped when I found out that there was a famous soldier or a couple of famous soldiers who'd won all the medals, and they were actually pathological, murderers, and they were just making shit up. And they would just shoot somebody and say, "Oh, look, he was a Chad," and they'd talk themselves up so much they'd get bravery medals for murders. The leadership, it was such a sort of thick plot. They either knew or were reckless to that fact, and they'd give them medals and they'd say, "This is great," because the leaders were using them as much as these crooked soldiers were using the leaders, because the leaders, by having heroic soldiers, it allowed more people using that kind of nationalist, almost like a sporting team. It allowed people to support the war. The wars always helped electoral, standing in front of an Australian flag or an American flag and saying, we need to fight the war on terror. Won elections. Election after election was won by people who wanted to use that imagery about standing strong and making sacrifice for freedom. And so both sides were using each other, unscrupulous soldiers and unscrupulous governments. War crimes were covered up. And I think, as I said, the real kicker was we were prepared to sacrifice innocent soldiers, not just on the battlefield, but we would, when words started creeping out about war crimes, and they needed to be seen to be doing something. It was all a Potemkin village. Everything was about being seen to be doing something. It didn't matter what the reality was. And so they found some scapegoats as some soldiers who'd done nothing wrong. And they wanted to put them in jail in order to hide as a smokescreen this pathological kind of murdering. And that really flipped me to say, this is not some sort of heat in the moment idea where our soldiers got carried away fighting the good fight. This is something so cynical where we allow murders, we cover up murders, we reward murderers, and if there's ever any problem, we throw innocent people in jail. And of course, the mainstream media played along with it. There's only really two streams of media in Australia. And it's very easy to control them if you've got a bag of money. And I couldn't, my disillusionment got deeper and deeper because no one was even interested in the story. You'd think that's a pretty bloody big story. As I said, it was an Australian Watergate, not just the war crimes, but the fact that the political leaders must have known, just like the sort of Watergate burglary, and to say that wasn't about the burglary, it was about who knew what and were they manipulating it for wider ends. But no one wanted to carry the story. Eventually the ABC did. They were scared of the wider implications because it's just too big. And one of the things that will come up in the whistleblowing fest is the psychology of being a whistleblower. You've done a good job with Tony Blair and in the Franck Magennis. I'll grant you that. In that everyone I know in England or whatever, they think he's a criminal. Everyone thinks he's a criminal. So at least people get it over there. They might not be able to do that much about it, but you have done a good job in that people understand that it was kind of a bit of a big conspiracy. You know, people make jokes about conspiracies, but it was a conspiracy. You know, it was a conspiracy at a very high level, and with the consequences of thousands of lives. And it was just like you said, it was corporations manipulating the state, or the state going along with it, and a lot of really good, honest people dying as a result. And accountability is what we need. That's my next step, and it links into sort of Julian Assange's case, when obviously the corporate media have a lot to answer for. People can be convinced that these things did happen, but they just need a little bit of persuading, a little bit of pressure. One of the inspirational things for me is the Watergate case, and the fact that that did happen, and the Vietnam War, the withdrawal. People power can work. We may have to work out how to put pressure on the corporate media to actually covering the truths of what's going on. As I said, I've got an unusual strategy, whereas I'm prepared to go to jail in order to bring light on it. In some ways, the worst thing that could happen to me now is that the charges are dropped. I've got a platform, and you talked about that. I'm going to have to look him up, but the founder of the Charter Movement, that's my idol, you know, to do some jail time and just make it quite clear I'm prepared to go to jail to get accountability at these highest levels. I'm a middle class, well-educated guy who used to work for the machine, and I still believe in the rule of law. But my country is not the country of lies. My country is the country of truth. It's not a matter of, you know, my country right or wrong. And there are people who I would call my countrymen in every landmass in the world, and there are people who are my enemies who are in the Australian government. I think we moved on from the idea that depending on where you live in the world, you're either good or bad, and it's actually depending on your moral standards that you're good. I want to move on, and I'd like to come and help you with the Tony Blair thing. I think it's a really good idea to try to even get him chucked out of the bar. I mean, that sort of stuff can hurt people. They might pretend it doesn't, but that, you know, even getting someone banned from it, I mean, it's worth pursuing those things, because as a whistleblower myself, the one thing that I won't feel a failure if I go to jail. The one thing I will feel a failure about is if I never get any kind of accountability. And at least with Blair, you're a couple of steps down the road. The head of our armed forces at the time of the war crimes, he should be accountable. The Minister of Defence, he should be accountable. But we're a couple of steps behind you over here, in that people don't really see that it started at the top. Maybe after my case they might. But I think I would urge you to go on with that, because that's the sort of thing that gives a whistleblower a great heart. And it doesn't matter. You just need to make examples of some people to say you are not immune from accountability when you make these decisions. You may think you're going to be, because you've got corporate media. Anyway, I've talked for too long, but I'm obviously very excited about being here. I'll take any questions. And it gives me such strength to see people like you guys around the world. And I will be fighting from my end, and I hope very much to come and meet you one day.
Thank you so much, David. And when you spoke, it made me think of the Charlotte Bronte, when she said, if all the world hated you and believed you wicked, while your own conscience approved of you and absolved you from guilt, you would not be without friends. And actually, you are far from without friends, David. When you stand in court, you not only represent millions, but possibly billions of people across the world who do not see the war machine as a necessity. So thank you so much for what you have done, and we will be here in support of you and hope to see you in London soon. We had a few other speakers who were scheduled to be here, Rod Driver, Sami Ramadhani, and Clare Daly. We still hope that Clare Daly will be able to come, but Rod Driver and Sami were not able to make it for different reasons. So we do have a little bit of extra time. If you have any questions, please do put them in the box, and I will do my best to get as many of them as I can to our fantastic panelists. Now, the next speaker is one of the co-founders of the Stop the War Coalition. Now, we can never forget that over 1 million people took to the streets in London 2003. But simultaneous to that, it is believed that 30 million people were mobilized globally. That is the largest simultaneous demonstration in recorded human history. And as John said in the years afterwards, that when a decision was being made so clearly against the will of the majority of the public, a death of civil liberties would be seen as a necessity by the establishment. He has a wonderful book on the Levelers' Revolution and the People's History of London with Lindsay German. I highly recommend that one for sure, and has been a very important figure in the Don't Extradite Assange campaign. So please, people, give your attention to John Rees from Stop the War Coalition.
Loki, thanks very much for that very kind introduction, and my congratulations to Deepa and others who've organised this event. I want to start with the Assange campaign. As Loki says, I've been working on the Don't Extradite Assange campaign for a couple of years now, and I'm sure that the case is very familiar to most people listening today. The case is, however, reaching an absolutely decisive point, and it's the urgency of matters at the moment that I want to speak to at the moment. The facts of the case, the rights and wrongs of the case are, despite all the years of swirling rumour and accusation that have surrounded Julian Assange, remarkably simple. They boil down to this. If you think that you have the right to know what the government and the major corporations in your society are doing in your name, then you are a supporter of Julian Assange. If you think that the only thing that the press should have access to are the PR releases of government departments and corporations, then fair enough, he did something wrong. But I think there are vanishingly few people in our society who believe the latter. I think that they believe they have a right to know how their sons and daughters are expected to die, and they have a right to know how the money they pay in taxes is being spent. And I think they think that it is a public service if people reveal to them the truth of those matters. And I think when the argument is put as simply and clearly as that, there are very few people who would defend what the United States government is trying to do with the Espionage Act in jailing Julian Assange, and what the British government is doing in assisting them in the extradition of Julian Assange to face those charges. But it's not the substantive issues involved in the case that I want to dwell on, it's the urgency of taking action at the moment. People will know, I'm sure, that the Westminster Magistrates Court found on the 4th of January that Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States because the US prison system is, in the words of the judgment, oppressive, and that he would be a suicide risk if he were put into that system. The judgment was, in every other respect, a terrible judgment. It found in favour of the United States case on issue after issue to do with freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The reason why things are now so urgent is that within the next few weeks, the next 3 weeks in fact, the appeal court will decide whether or not it's going to hear the United States appeal to have that decision to stop extradition overturned and to restart the process of extraditing Julian Assange. In the same kind of timescale, we'll know whether or not the cross appeal by Julian's defense lawyers to have all the bad stuff that came down the line in that judgment overturned will also be heard by the High Court. And if the High Court decides that it will hear the case, and I'm pretty sure, seeing it's the United States government request, it will decide to hear the case, then perhaps within a matter of weeks, and certainly within a matter of months, a definitive decision will be made about that extradition case. So, if you are already involved in this discussion, please do redouble your efforts to make sure that that decision goes the right way. If you haven't yet been involved in it, now is the time to get involved. And whether you are newly involved or have been involved for a long time, please begin the process of speaking to as many people who are not yet involved on as wide a basis as you possibly can. This is, and I don't believe this is an exaggeration, this is the definitive civil liberties case of the 21st century. And we cannot afford for it to go the wrong way. And not just because of the rights and wrongs of the imprisonment of Julian Assange, this is the second point I want to make, but because of the context in which this case is now taking place. It isn't a deliberate decision of either the US government or the British government that this should be the case, but it is nevertheless the case that this is happening in the timescale, in the same timescale, and in the same political framework as the alterations to the Official Secrets Act to make it an even more draconian and authoritarian piece of legislation than it already is, for the police bill to be passed through the House of Commons, although that's been halted for the moment by the protests against it. I'm sure, however, that this government will bring it back into the legislative timetable as soon as it feels it's able to. And it's also happening in the same timescale as the Spy Cops inquiry into the behaviour of the Special Demonstration Squad. Now, I declare an interest here. I'm a core participant in the Spy Cops inquiry, as is the Stop the War coalition. It's quite a thing to read through the police reports of your own political activity, to see them forwarded directly to the security services in this country, not remain within the Metropolitan Police, to see the level of deployment of officers into the Labour and Socialist movement. Now, I spread out all this before you because they are connected. These are multiple examples of the way in which the police and the state machine attempt to suppress, subvert, and criminalize dissent. Entirely peaceful consent, by the way. You may have seen the reports from the Spy Cops inquiry of the sustained, over a 25-year period, sustained police spying on Peter Hain for his work in the anti-apartheid movement. This was a civil liberties, civil disobedience movement at its most extreme. It was, in fact, a mainstream democratic movement of citizens exercising completely legal rights to protest, yet it was systematically spied on by the state. Julian Assange, of course, was simply doing the work that any reputable investigative journalist and he finds himself, I don't know, perhaps that was a moment where the state directly intervened to mute the speakers in this. I'm not sure, but you see my point, that we're not looking at a single instance of justice gone awry. We're looking at the systematic attempts by the government to silence perfectly legitimate forms of democratic argument and democratic protest. And so I encourage you to see the context of this, and I encourage you to draw from that context that these specific cases that are in the public eye at the moment are perhaps even more important than you might see them if they were taken individually and separately. The third thing I want to say, and this will be my final point, is to draw the connections between whistleblowing and mass political protest, the role of resistance movements more widely. I think it's sometimes, understandably, because people who are involved in whistleblowing take enormous risks and are incredibly brave in deciding to speak out. But I think that sometimes generates a kind of sensibility that there are kind of the heroes that do this and the mass which watch them doing it. And I think that's a disabling framework. And I want to speak a little bit about why it's fundamentally inaccurate. To take Julian's case, for instance, when WikiLeaks released the absolutely devastating logs on the Iraq and Afghan wars in 2010, those wars and subsequent occupations had already been going for 7 years. The demonstrations and protests that Loki refers to by the Stop the War Coalition and others internationally had already created an environment, an audience that wanted to listen to that kind of material, that knew in general what the truth of the war was and were particularly receptive to and had a particular use for the kind of material that WikiLeaks released. So there was a symbiotic relationship between the people making the leak and the people who built the mass movement. It's even clearer, actually, in the case of Catherine Gunn, the subject of the recent Official Secret film, when she released the leak from GCHQ showing that the Americans were spying on delegates to the United Nations. Where did she take the document that she took from GCHQ? She took it to Yvonne Ridley, who was working as part of the Stop the War Coalition and was a journalist who put it in the hands of the Observer. Where did she go? Immediately after she made that leak, she went on to the demonstration of February 2003 that the Stop the War Coalition organised. In her case, there was a direct political link, direct political participation of the person making the leak in the wider movement